Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Today, we're finishing up Book 5 of the Ethics, which is the Justice book, looking at its final chapter, chapter 11. So let's turn to the text, okay? Let's wrap it up. Last chapter, he dealt with the equitable, right? Explaining what equity was and its relation to what justice is. Now, today, he's going to wrap it up. He says, whether it is possible to do injustice to oneself or not is manifest from what has been said. So, the question of can we do justice to oneself or injustice to oneself? We address this. For some just things have been arranged by law in reference to the whole of virtue. For example, the law does not command one to kill oneself, and what the law does not command, it forbids. There's a famous line: "What the law does not command, it therefore forbids." And I think this you have to understand this principle here. This is the argument. Oh, this is always true. For the ancient world is what the law says, and that's what you should do. So what it commands, what it does not command you to do, it forbids. Right? And I think this. Okay, this is true in that sense, right? But this is the point about the metaphor he uses is about killing oneself. You shouldn't kill oneself in that sense. Why? Again, this is tied to the question of harming oneself, right? Harming is to harm is to kind of to 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 act unjustly towards, right? This idea that when you harm somebody, you are committing an injustice to them, for the most part, doing something unjust. A harm is, and that's the general sense. But harming, doing benefit, a good is justice, and then harming would be unjust. But then some problem with that is that sometimes maybe harming justice requires you to harm somebody, and to benefit them would be committing an injustice, right? This is some of the problems that we've dealt with through the texts and this examination. So he's returning to the question of, well, can you do injustice to yourself? And then he says, well, this law is saying it doesn't commit you to kill yourself. So what the law does not command, it forbids. Further, when contrary to law, a person harms another voluntarily, and not because he's retaliating, he thereby does injustice. And what he does so voluntarily when he knows both whom he harms and what with what. So therefore, in other words, it's not only that he's willfully doing it; he knows he's harming them. The voluntary is not only that he's doing it, but he knows he's harming this person and how he's harming them. Okay, um, a person who, on account of his anger, kills himself voluntarily does this contrary to correct reason, right reason, or correct ortho. This is this is again 46 here. Correct law, correct law. It's whether there's a text. Some manuscripts will put logos here, others will put nomos here. And the question, this is the editors here, the translators here, Collins and Bartlett picks reason, right? Correct reason. Orthologos, right? Not correct law, right? On a contrary to correct reason, which the law does not permit. In other words, they do this. In other words, they kill themselves voluntarily. Does this contrary to not only contrary to correct reason, which the law does not permit. Therefore, it can also be law too. So that's because maybe it is the correct law, which the thing does not permit. But that doesn't make sense either because the law would law, right? That's why we have double nomos. So therefore, there might be an error in the text that someone corrected over and did. This is why the text is. This is why we have debates about this in Greek, the Greek text, the different manuscripts. So therefore, it doesn't. In other words, out of anger, he kills himself. Right. This is both contrary to. It's contrary to what correct reason is, right reason, correct reason, orthologos, and therefore, which the law does not permit this killing of himself. Right. Therefore, he does injustice, right? So out of anger, right? He does it out of anger. He's out of anger. He's angry, but he does it. He does it from choice, okay? not because he's out of anger and doesn't. He's so deranged. His mind is so out of it. The question is, would it be unjust if this is unjust when he does? He out of anger he kills himself because he chooses to, versus and does so out of choice. And that whereas what happens when he's so deranged, his mind is so deranged, right? That he does, and that he wouldn't do so if his mind was not deranged. He would not do so. Then is that injustice also? That's another aspect of this, right? Um, this is contrary to reason, in which law does more. Therefore, he does injustice. But to whom? Who does he commit justice to? It is to the city, and not is it to the city, but not him to himself? For he suffers voluntarily, and no one suffers injustice voluntarily. Hence, the city imposes a penalty, and a certain dishonor attaches him who destroys himself on the grounds that he does the city an injustice. So, in other words, he makes the argument that therefore the question here is who's the harm being done to? Yes, he's harming himself, but okay, he's doing so voluntarily. Um, and therefore no one does something unjust voluntarily in that sense, right? Therefore, no one suffers injustice voluntarily. So the harm that is doing in that sense is he suffers voluntarily, and no one suffers injustice involuntarily. Hence, so the injustice that is occurring here is not towards himself, but towards the city, right? So therefore, there's two aspects of injustice. There's in other words, being people in a community in a city that shares together a life together and obligations towards each other. Therefore, harms that are done. There's two harms. There's harms to people and harms to the city. The harms to the community, the body that is the koinonia that constitutes the people that for their benefit and their good. So here, the person who kills himself is not harming himself. The argument is because he's not doing injustice. He thinks this is a good. He's not involuntary. There's no injustice here. The argument is that you don't suffer injustice voluntarily. Okay, he's therefore this is the argument. He's willfully doing it. He chooses this. So it is not unjust to him. It is unjust to the city in that sense, and therefore the city gives him dishonor, and the punishment is towards that, right? On the grounds that he does the city injustice. Further in the case, now next paragraph. Further in the case where someone who does injustice is not only unjust, but in other words, who does injustice is not only unjust, but not wholly base. It is not possible to do injustice to oneself, right? In other words, further, what about the case where someone does injustice, but justice is only unjust, but not base? In other words, his character isn't corrupted completely. Like this, he did the wrong act. He acted unjustly. An unjust act was done, but he himself is not unjust, right? He's not base, vile in that sense. It is not possible to do injustice to oneself. This latter case is different from the former one. There is a sense in which the unjust person, like the coward, is wicked in such a way that he is not totally wicked. So he's wrong. So he too is not unjust in the sense of being totally wicked. Okay, this person who commits a just, he's not completely base. He's not completely wicked, but he's done a bad thing. He's done an unjust thing. He's done a bad thing, an unjust thing. So what about this? For if it were possible to be unjust to oneself, right? This is that another clause, right? For the same thing would be, in other words, for the same thing would have been simultaneously taken away from and added to the same person, right? If it was possible to be unjust to yourself. So, in other words, it'd be taken both simultaneously taken away and added to the same person. But this is impossible. In other words, you can't both add and take away that act. That's impossible, right? That makes no sense, right? So, but that is impossible. Okay, right? It's a contradiction, adding and taking away. Okay, uh, 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 um, rather, it is always necessary for the just and the unjust to involve more than one person. So, therefore, justice cannot be just merely about oneself. The question of justice involves my relation with another person, someone else, another self. It's not about oneself. It cannot. This is the point. He says that the issue of justice and injustice is not about oneself. It is about, and this is the point, that it doesn't make sense. If I do this and I harm, well, how can I benefit? And I don't suffer injustice voluntarily, so therefore I think this benefits me, but I at the same time do something wrong. Therefore, this doesn't make sense, right? There's something unjust, but not. So therefore, this is that weird kind of moment here, right? It must involve another person, involve more than one person. Further, the unjust is voluntary, stems from a choice, and is prior in time, hence to the harm one undergoes. In other words, it's prior. In other words, the choice is prior to the harm. So therefore, it is by choice. It is, in other words, this is the unjust act. The unjust thing is voluntary and stems from a choice that is and is prior in time to the actual harm. For the person who, because he suffered some harm, also reciprocates the same thing, is not held to do injustice. But if the same person does these things to himself, he simultaneously both suffers and does them, right? So this is the problem of so in other words, I've been harmed and I then harm someone. That's I'm doing to someone else, right? It's not that. But if I've received harm, I've done something wrong, but I'm harming myself. I'm both doing harm and having harm done to me, right? And therefore, he simultaneously both suffers and does harm. Further, if someone could do himself injustice, right, it would be possible for him to have suffered injustice voluntarily, right? This is that weird aspect, right? The idea that you can't suffer, have suffered injustice voluntarily. No, it can't do that. So therefore, in other words, this is why this is. In other words, if he could do justice, it would be possible for him to suffer justice involuntarily, right? This idea we wouldn't choose to have something unjust happen to us. And in addition to these considerations, no one does injustice without committing particular acts of injustice. So therefore, in other words, there's in other words, you cannot be unjust without committing a particular act of injustice. No one commits adultery with one's own wife, breaks into his own house, or steals his own things. And this is why I would argue, this is also my argument, there's no such thing as, if plagiarism is that, to say self plagiarism is a contradiction of this concept. Because why? How could you taking your own words, plagiarizing yourself is taking your own things. So this is why I think I make fun of this argument of self. There's a whole concern about self-plagiarism. Now, one could argue that you're committing fraud by the act of presenting something. If you're just merely taking what you've said and doing it without altering it somehow to make it fit a new thing, but if you just did the same thing over and over again, that would be fraud. But sometimes someone would take, well, I mean, I've always argued that some things you write just well, and you're using that point again. Instead of merely pointing to the point, you want to repeat it so people understand what the point is. Or just go look at I'm not going to make the argument here. Go look at here. No, that's unsatisfying for the argument. And you reinventing wheels is kind of stupid, right? So therefore, this is a kind of that you can. I think there is a point of this. So, but this is just what came in my mind about this. This is an example of this problem, right? And in addition to these, considering that no one does injustice committing a particular act of injustice, as he gives that no one commits adultery to his own wife, no one breaks the house and steals his own things. On the whole, the perplexing question of one being able to do injustice to himself is resolved also by the distinction being made concerning whether a person suffers injustice voluntarily. So therefore, in other words, this question of can you suffer injustice to oneself is tied to the assumption that if you Can you suffer injustice voluntarily? Can you say, okay, it's unjust, and therefore I accept it unjust? You don't care, and that makes it what? Mhm. The argument is that no, you don't. In other words, you don't. When injustice happens, no one voluntarily accepts having injustice. They might not have the power to resist, but doesn't make that. In other words, it still makes it involuntary. If justice happens to you, you did not want it. You would not have chosen it. If you've chosen it, then it's no longer unjust. Okay. Again, that's the whole point about that's a big problem in, let's say, abusive relationships. When does choice matter, right? That's the whole question. When does a person voluntarily chooses to have injustice? Now, we would say that that person is not of right mind. Therefore, no one would rationally do this. Therefore, when they say they want to be abused or they do that, then they're not of correct mind. Therefore, the abuse is always abuse. The harm is always a harm. If they say they want it, no, they're not of right mind. That's why sadomasochism. What about sadomasochists? We have people who like to be beaten up and people who get sexual pleasure. See, again, these people are. I mean, the logic here is such things are anormal, right? There's something wrong with their idea of. Therefore, what is bad? What is for most people the norm? Bad thing, they get pleasure from it. So therefore, they're atypical. They're outliers to the norm, and they're defective in the sense, right? They have a defect from what the other one. They're an exception in this weird way. But does this? But we would. The problem here is the norm could not accept this. You could not tolerate it, saying, "Oh, for them it's okay," but then what about this? Oh, they really like it, right? This is, I mean, what happens when does abuse become normalized and accepted? Okay, this is the problem here. And this is why the question, you don't commit adultery with your own wife, you don't break into your own things, but therefore the idea is that on the whole perplexing question resolves itself. Now, the question here is this next paragraph, the ending paragraph. It is manifest too that both the suffering of injustice and doing an injustice are base or bad. Are bad or base, right? Both suffering injustice and doing injustice, both are bad. The suffering injustice is to have less, or suffering injustice is to have less, and doing injustice is to have more than the middle term. Just as is the case with health and medicine and good condition and gymnastic training. So therefore, in other words, suffering bad things is to have less, and to do injustice is to have more, right? So therefore, this is also true with medicine and gymnastics. But nevertheless, the doing injustice is worse. They're both bad, but doing is worse than suffering. For doing injustice is accompanied by vice and is blameworthy. And this vice is either complete or unqualified, or nearly so. For not every unjust act done voluntarily is accompanied by injustice. So again, this is an important point. Not every unjust act itself is accompanied by injustice. In other words, injustice means it is injustice is that this is wrong. This act is an unjust act, but it's not necessarily an act of this. This is not injustice. Okay, it is not accompanied by injustice. That's a very important point. So therefore, what is he saying here? He's saying that for doing injustice is accompanied by vice and is blameworthy. But this vice is either complete or unqualified or nearly so, right? Yet suffering injustice is without vice and injustice. In other words, it's bad, it's not a good, it's unjust, it's wrong, but it's the person who happened is he's not blameworthy for it. It's not a vice. It doesn't make him vicious. It doesn't make him unjust. So it's not, he is not committing an unjust thing. In other words, something bad is happening to him. It is unjust that's happening to him, but he is not unjust in this, or it doesn't make him vicious or unjust. The person who does it, now, the rule is usually that doing it, usually, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're completely unjust. But if it is such a thing that is, it corrupted you, that you are so corrupted that you're doing it not because of a mistake, but you're doing it from choice in this sense, and you're doing it continually, then you become corrupted, and then you are unjust in that sense, or vicious. Yet the suffering of injustice is without vice and injustice, right? In itself, then, the suffering of injustice is less base or less bad, though nothing prevents it from becoming incidentally the greater harm. In other words, it makes you worse. It can make you so bad. In other words, you can be suffered injustice, and that suffering could make things worse and make you worse. It doesn't automatically make you bad or make you unjust or vice, but the condition such is that it can lead you to become worse, right? This is that whole point about it makes things worse. It prevents from incidentally the greater harm. But this is of no concern to the art involved. In other words, that the art in question is involved is not there. Rather, medicine calls pleurisy a greater malady than stumbling. Right? Pleurisy is worse than stumbling, although sometimes the latter might be worse incidentally, if it should turn out that he who stumbles is seized by the enemy is killed because he fell. Right? In other words, it can lead to another word. Pleurisy is worse than stumbling. But if you stumble, you can get into a situation that is greater harm. Okay, but still, pleurisy is worse than that. But this doesn't prevent something that is less worse having a greater harm. All right, and that's a specific circumstance, right? Incidentally, right? So now let's wrap up. This is the penultimate paragraph here. Metaphorically and in reference to a certain similarity, there is something just that pertains not to a person in relation to himself, but to certain parts of himself. So wait a minute. So therefore, it's metaphorically in a certain similarity. In other words, it's a metaphor, and there's a reference to certain similarity. Regards not, there is something that is just that pertains not to the person in relation to himself, but to a part of himself, right? So the hand or some part of us to this, right? There's this kind of metaphorical justice. This is not this is not the just in every sense of the term, but rather in the particular to the slave master or to the household manager. So, in other words, this is the kind of why this you can say the just. In other words, that there is a relation of justice between, let's say, the master, the slave master, and the household manager, right? The slave master or household manager. There is a slave between the slave master or household manager has a relationship about there's a justice that is a relation to the parts that it belong to, right? That the master of slaves and the slave, right? In fact, this is the problem here is the word slave, delos, that can also mean servants, and that's why this is why in that sense servants are we would radically distinguish between delos and servants and slaves, but the Greeks really didn't do that. There's a blurring here. The servants as a slave because they're unfree. The idea, in other words, if anyone who's unfree, slave is unfree. Therefore, servant is unfree in this sense. They're not a free person. They serve. Their bodies serve the free person. So therefore, that's why delos is a very weird term in Greek. The slave, right? The slave. This is why the master of slave master, the master despotike, particularly to a despotike, the master of slave, and the household oikonomikos, the household manager, right? These things are governing parts. They're ruling parts of that. Maybe the metaphor is the city, the citizen, right? The city also has a parts of the city. We understand that, but what about the subordinate entities? And therefore, the body itself, maybe the part of my arm and my hand, or some other thing that we speak of metaphorically. But he's want to say that there is a justice in this to the master. The master will treat. It's not weird. The relationship between the master and the slave, there's a justice between that. Because what? It's a relation to this, but it's the proper relation. So what does that mean? That's a very complicated problem. What is the and the question is, he will say that these are in book 1, chapter 1. These are not the same. Okay, these are different things, and therefore they have different parts, and therefore they have different relations, and the justice of these things will differ from each other. Right? In these sorts of arguments, the part of the soul possessing reason is set apart from the non-rational. The part of the soul possessing reason is set apart from the non-rational. Hence, to those who look at these considerations, there does in fact seem to be injustice in relation to oneself, because in these parts of the soul, it is possible to suffer something contrary to their respective longings. Okay. So therefore, that's why this is why you can talk about the parts of the body, right? Again, this is Republic. See the note here and sort of argument. This is Republic. Lines 435a and following, right? He says, this is the Republic, this is the question of the parts of the thing, right? The parts and the whole, the soul. This is the tripartite soul, right? The reasoning, the desiring, and the spirited, right? And therefore, this is the balance. Justice is a balance, and that when it's not ruling, that these should rule. Reason should rule both spirit and passion. If these over control reason, it's unjust, right? It is problematic. So the part must have proper relation to it, and therefore it is an injustice to oneself when the irrational part rules over the rational part. This is the problematic. This is wrong. This is an injustice in that sense. But this is only contrary to what is their respective longings in that sense. That they have a longing, they want they want something, and reason says no, but they deliver what contrary to what reason tells them. This is the harm it does, right? The spirit and desire both may want things that are not good for them, okay, and what is beneficial to them, good or beneficial for them. The reason knows what is truly beneficial. They don't. They just simply want, right? They want, or they're anger in that sense. The spirited and desiring both have a want. They are directed towards or compelled towards something they desire. The body usually wants pleasure to avoid pain and seek pleasure, and this one seeks usually to seek honor, right? Seek honor and glory, right? These spirited things. And therefore, they will overcome pain to get their glory. Here, the people who seek pleasure will avoid desire, and that's so. Therefore, this is that whole line in the Republic, right? Well, here, this is the whole point that he's trying to say here, right? That the soul possessing reason will set apart from the non-rational. Hence, those who look to these considerations, there does in fact seem to be injustice in relation to himself, right? Seems to be. Again, because this is a metaphor. See, Plato uses analogies. A lot of Platonic Socratic arguments are analogies. And the problem with analogies is that their analogies are not are actually, there's an error here. In fact, this would be a big argument that the analogy of the arts, the argument from the arts, the analogy of the arts, that Socrates often uses to make arguments. He will argue that is not absolutely true. It's problematic. Aristotle will make this point twice in Politics, and therefore suggest that the argument from the arts is false politically. Okay, that is very interesting in that sense, and I think that is maybe because of that the political world deals with a greater aspect of the particular than the arts actually do. There's a greater complexity in action than in making. Okay, um, uh, so therefore, it is possible to suffer something contrary to their respective longings. Right, that's how it ends. Just as for the ruler and the ruled, then there seems to be something just in relation to each other. There also there so also is in the case of these parts of the soul, so that the body. So therefore, this is interesting. He mentions the slave and the household manager, but the analogy isn't that, because these were discerned different parts, separate parts, but rather the parts. No, see, this is interesting. This is why this is the slave master and the household manager. They're parts, right? This is what the household manager has the relationship between husband, wife, parent, child, master, slave, right? And therefore, there is this otherness towards this. There is a other that is discrete, and the same thing was the master and the slave. There's an other. But this is not the same. The justice and these things are different from each other, from the city in that sense. And therefore, when referring to the body as a combination of parts that is connected to a whole, right? And therefore, this idea of the parts of the soul, right? The Socratic, Platonic construction of the soul, the tripartite soul, and dealing with this, right? This is the argument, right? This is the therefore it's very deceptive for him to throw in the slave master and the household manager and this thing might mislead us. So I don't know why it's there. Maybe to think about it, maybe to understand that there is a problematic, that there is a difference here, and that therefore this, in other words, the soul is, in other words, the rational part of this. Maybe that is that thing. In other words, that the household diokos and the slave master is more the question of the rational ruling the irrational, right? Like the argument from the soul. But the city is not like that. It's more complex. So that's very interesting. So just as for the ruler and rule, then there seems to be something just in relation to each other. So too in the parts of a case of these parts of the soul, right? That's how he ends that discussion, this metaphorical aspect here. He goes, concerning justice and the other ethical virtues, ethical virtues, right? These are then let the distinctions be made in this manner. So he's completing the discussion of what he says justice. He's concerning justice, but also the ethical virtues, the virtues of ethics, the virtues of character, right? That we've discussed in book 3 and 4. Therefore, book 5 concludes this question of ethical virtues, the ethical virtues, or he says the moral virtues, right? Which justice is the kind of crown at that moment. So we end it here, okay? So therefore, let's stop. This ends it. We go next chapter. Next time we'll look at book 6, which deals with the intellectual virtues, the virtues of the mind, okay? And therefore, this is how we're going to switch. We're going to switch now to this. And therefore, we end ethics, character, the question of character. And now we try to get to the question of the mind itself and how the soul, the question of the higher, because the higher virtues in that sense, the virtue in its highest and most ruling sense, we could argue, right? So we'll stop here and we'll do it. If you have any comments, any questions, please put it about this chapter. Please put it below, and when I see them, I will respond to them in that sense, like this. If you've liked it, like it. If you like what I did here, like it. Please like it. Hit the like button. Share it far and wide. Share your social media and share it about. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe. If you know somebody who would, again, it help. Both liking and subscribing helps the algorithm and get more attention for the web. What we do here. If you know somebody's interested, get them to come and look at things, right? But also encourage them to subscribe to build the channel, because I want to build. We need to, a certain option. Once we grow a certain size, certain other options become available that can help me do what I do. If you didn't like it, okay, you can thumbs down. But if you thumbs down it, please say why. This way, people, not only I can learn, but others who watch the video can learn from it, right? So therefore, this is the purpose of why I'm doing this, to learn, to help people to understand these things. If you want to follow me on social media, my social media links are below in the description area. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and follow my research and things like this, you can go look at the academic social media links below the social media links, and therefore find out the various academic social media archives, like archives and things like this, where my scholarship is available at, and more about me or I teach and things like that. Another thing you can do is you can, if you want to help me to do what I do, you want to financially help me, assist me to do what I do, you can do so through Subscribe Star or Patreon. List the links below. Another way you can help is by buying one of my books. The books are listed below. Again, you can do so by buying at your local bookstore or through an online bookseller like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or any and similar such things. If you want to really help, if you have a friend who's studying the politics, I would recommend them buying my notebook for Aristotle's Politics on Ulu, because it is a kind of a study guide, a teach a guide through the text, not interpretation, not a kind of academic interpretation, but rather kind of a how to navigate the book thing, and therefore kind of useful for that purpose. If you buy it through Lulu directly, I will make the money that the bookstores get. So please think about that if you want to buy something. Okay, that's it. We again, next time we come, we start book 6, chapter 1. Take care, bye bye, and have a great day.